During the summer and autumn months of 1986, a vicious serial killer known as the Stockwell Strangler stalked the housing estates of North and South London, targeting elderly men and women who were sexually assaulted and brutally strangled to death in their own homes. The first such murder occurred in April 1986, with the death of Nancy Ems, a 78-year-old spinster who was initially considered to have died from natural causes. A subsequent post-mortem soon established she had been raped and strangled. The following month, 2 elderly men were found suffocated and strangled in their beds, and there had been a rash of burglaries in the area which some suspected might be a possible motive. Police were not quick to link these murders to a single perpetrator. Then on June 9, another woman was found strangled in her flat in Wandsworth. This time the killer did not sexually assault the victim, but did leave a clear fingerprints at the crime scene. Later that same month 2 elderly Polish men were sexually assaulted and murdered, whilst another managed to survive his encounter to give police a chilling description of the killer. In July, a further 3 men were found murdered under similar circumstances, and police were closing in on the elusive murderer. On 24 July, 80-year-old Florence Tisdall was found dead in the same way as previous victims, only this time a witness reported a strange man she encountered near the scene of the crime. Just 4 days later, police arrested a suspect in what the press were calling the Stockwell Strangler case. Burglaries in the City of London are a not altogether uncommon occurrence. However, during the mid-1980s a prolific burglar was targeting elderly victims, one of the most vulnerable members of society. 78-year-old Nancy Eileen Ems was a retired schoolteacher who lived on her own on West Hill Road, a suburb of Wandsworth in south-west London. The reclusive spinster suffered from a mild form of dementia, and as a result she often lived in squalid conditions in her run-down basement flat. In response, the local council organized for home help who would come several times a week to help clean up and cook meals for her. In the early morning hours of April 9, 1986, the home help visited Nancy at the flat during one of her weekly visits and found her dead. Ems was found tucked up in her bed with the bedclothes pulled up to her chin, with no signs of violence or anything to suggest suspicious circumstances. It appeared she had passed away peacefully in her sleep several days earlier. Her doctor examined the body and believed she had died roughly 3 days previously, recording a verdict of natural causes on the death certificate. However, before the cremation was about to take place, the home help noticed the portable television set was missing from the cluttered flat and suspecting something sinister had occurred, and the police were alerted. Nancy Ems. A post-mortem was then carried out which revealed Ems had severe bruising to her upper and lower body, cracked ribs and finger marks around her throat. She had died from strangulation, and it was believed she had been sexually assaulted, because there were traces of semen found on her body. Although it was impossible to establish, it was suspected she had been raped after her death. It was the opinion of the pathologist that the victim had been attacked whilst she slept, her killer having knelt on her chest, which resulted in the cracked ribs and severe bruising, then placed his left hand over mouth and throttled her with his right hand. She was then turned over and the killer sexually assaulted her, before rearranging the body to make it appear she had died peacefully in her sleep, with the bedclothes tucked up under her chin to cover the bruising to her throat. The television set was then removed, before the killer left the same way he came in, through an unsecured window. Investigators surmised that killer had found easy access point into the flat through an open window, as Nancy was known to often sleep with a window left slightly ajar when it was humid. Because of the mini heat wave the UK experienced that spring and summer, police said it might have been an opportunistic crime which escalated into murder. The victim was an elderly woman who wouldn't have been able to put up much resistance against an adult male intruder. Forensic officers were able to locate a hair sample on the bed sheets at the scene of the crime. This single head hair was described as belonging to a person of Afro-Caribbean descent, and it was believed to have been left by the killer. With DNA and offender profiling still in its infancy in the UK, the police were left with no leads and began the long laborious process of trawling through the lists of burglars and sex offenders who were known to operate in the South London area in an effort to try and locate a possible suspect. In their search for a potential suspect, detectives also looked if there were any other murders which matched that of Nancy Ems. They found that during the previous month, two elderly men had been found murdered under very similar circumstances. On May 6, 73-year-old Charles Querelle of Southwark was discovered on his bed at his home in King James Street, having been suffocated, whilst 70-year-old Wilfred Parks was found on May 28, strangled in his bed. It appeared the killer of both men had waited for them to retire to bed for the night before entering through an unsecure window, then launching a cowardly attack, catching the victims off guard whilst they slept. When detectives searched further back, they came across the death of 57-year-old John Jordan, who had been found strangled beside his bed at his flat in Josephine Avenue, Brixton on February 4, 1986. Although there was no evidence to connect these crimes to the same individual, police were beginning to suspect that a serial killer might be targeting elderly victims in the London area. While police continued to search for the killer, another elderly woman would suffer a similar fate. Located on the Overton Road estate in Stockwell, Warwick House was a block of low-rise flats just a few miles from the basement flat where Nancy Emms lived. It was here that 67-year-old Janet Cockett was found dead in her first-floor flat, in what were very similar circumstances to the previous victim. So similar that her death was initially attributed to natural causes, before a post-mortem revealed she had 2 fractured ribs and had been strangled to death. The killer had once again staged the crime scene, with the bedclothes pulled up to her chin, so it appeared she had died from natural causes. Unlike the previous victim, Cockett had not been sexually assaulted, however her nightdress had been torn off and neatly folded by the killer. This time investigators noticed something strange, as it appeared the killer had repositioned several family photographs on a mantelpiece in the bedroom, placing them either face down or turned towards the wall. Janet had been the complete opposite of the reclusive spinster Emms, in that she had been married 3 times and had 4 children. She had been recently widowed, but was still active and enjoyed a busy social life, spending her time with family and friends whilst serving as the chairwoman of the Tenants Association. Police were able to locate a single thumb print on a plant pot from the mantelpiece and a clear palm print on a bedroom window, presumably left by the killer. It also appeared the killer had attempted to break into the residence of another elderly man, but was disturbed by a noise and fled. Although investigators now had DNA and fingerprint evidence from 2 separate crime scenes, they did not have any suspects, or know if the crimes were committed by the same individual. Detectives started a search of palm print records of offenders they held on record in an effort to find a match to their elusive killer. Despite 2 elderly victims killed in almost identical fashion roughly 5 miles apart, the cases were not immediately linked, chiefly because they were being investigated by different police stations, and although detectives working both cases did exchange information, they did not believe there was sufficient evidence to suspect the same attacker. It would be just over 2 weeks later when a potential victim survived his encounter with the vicious strangler. 73-year-old Frederick Prentice was a retired pensioner who lived in an old people's home known as Bradmead, which was on Cedars Road in Clapham. Prentice described for detectives his terrifying ordeal. At around 3 a.m. on the morning of June 27, he was suddenly awoken from his sleep by what sounded like footsteps in the passageway outside his room. When he sat up, he saw the shadowed outline of someone standing behind the frosted glass of his unlocked door, which was soon opened when a stranger entered his room. He said the man was dressed all in dark clothing, and as he fumbled to turn on the light, the intruder placed his finger against his lips indicating him to stay silent. Frederick Prentice. After he did this, the young man ran and jumped onto Mr. Prentice before he was able to alert someone. He gripped the old man's throat and began to squeeze hard, before relaxing it. He did this 4 times, squeezing his victim's windpipe in a powerful grip and then allowing him to breathe. Prentice recalled how the man had a deranged grin on his face and was clearly enjoying the sadistic game he was playing with his victim. The man then began hissing the same word over and over. Kill. 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 With the stranger's hand still gripped around his throat, Mr. Prentice was unable to shout out for help. Mustering all his remaining strength, he managed to press the panic button on the wall above his bed. As he did this, the man violently pushed Mr. Prentice against the wall, jumped off the bed and started running out of the room. Moments later a warden entered, responding to the panic alarm, but the intruder had fled. When police searched the room, they discovered the man must have gained access to the complex through an open window, which had been left open because of the sweltering heat. The description given by Fred Prentice of his attacker was understandably vague given his ordeal, but it did provide investigators with somewhat of a clearer understanding of the person they were searching for. He was described as being young, in his late teens to mid-20s, with dark hair and a suntanned complexion. Police suspected the intruder had been an experienced burglar, who felt comfortable entering residential properties where the possibility of capture was high. Fred Prentice was lucky to be alive, and police were now beginning to suspect that his attempted murder might be connected to the same individual who had killed Nancy Ems and Janet Cockett. Detectives were determined to catch this sadistic killer, who clearly gained great enjoyment from tormenting his elderly victims before strangling the life out of them. Police didn't have to wait long before the killer struck again. The next evening, on June 28, the killer would claim 2 victims in the same night. The strangler chose another old people's home, this time it was the council-run Somerville Hastings house in Stockwell Park Crescent. In the early morning hours, the night duty staff started to become suspicious at around 4 a.m. when they heard what sounded like someone using an electric razor.